Advocate podcast, a show where we celebrate, defend, support, and uplift voices of the LGBTQIA community. I'm your host, Stephen Chukumba. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Lizette and our unofficial, self-appointed executive producer, third co-host, and my younger brother, Anthony Chukumba.
Hello, everyone. Lizette here. She, her, AI. The mission of the Parent Advocate podcast is to elevate conversations and reframe narratives about trans and non-binary youth to help change hearts and minds.
Hello, everyone. I'm back. Anthony Chukumba. He, him, is just super glad to be back on the Parent Advocate podcast. Let's do this.
We are doing a special episode inspired by Anthony's frequent request for books to read so that he can be a better ally.
That's right, Stephen. Today, we're diving into 9 incredible books that shine a light on identity, resilience, and the beauty of living authentically. Each of us will share 3 books and we'll discuss them as a group. Let's get started. Ready, Anthony?
Ready. Let's do this. So my first recommendation is Page Boy, a memoir, the highly acclaimed 2023 autobiography by Canadian author, producer, actor, and LGBTQIA activist Elliot Page. Goodreads describes Page Boy as a groundbreaking coming-of-age memoir from the Academy Award-nominated actor Elliot Page. A generation-defining actor and one of the most famous trans advocates of our time, Elliot will now be known as an uncommon literary talent as he shares never-before-heard details and intimate interrogations of gender, love, mental health, relationships, and Hollywood. Reading Page Boy felt incredibly personal for me because I remember seeing Page in his breakout 2007 indie film Juno. I then followed his career pretty closely, including his roles in multiple X-Men movies, the Chris Nolan film Inception, the Netflix series The Umbrella Academy, and a ton of other movies I'm probably forgetting about. And one thing that really struck me is the fact that while I just assumed that Elliot was ecstatic when Juno was released and he seemingly became an overnight sensation, he was struggling mightily with dysphoria at the time and was utterly and completely miserable. Here's an excerpt of the book that really struck me, in which Page discussed his gender transition surgery. This is a complicated matter to write about because some people who are reading this have to wait years and years to finally have their surgery or will never have access to gender-affirming care. I can imagine anyone would feel angry, resentful, and roiled by my privilege, what it allows me. Time during a pandemic to not work and self-reflect. I am not from a place where it is illegal. I was able to go to a private clinic and pay the approximately $12,000. I had a place to stay, a friend who had the energy to care for me, food to eat as I recovered, a job right around the corner where I could be me. I didn't have to depend on a healthcare system that would leave me waiting potentially for years. Even though I am extremely lucky, this narrative where trans people have to feel lucky for these crumbs that we fought hard for and still fight for is perverse and manipulative. Here is the thing. I almost did not make it. The now I finally have, I did not see, and all I knew was permanent emptiness, a mystery I would never solve. Incessant without language, a depth of despair. Shameful with all that I had, what dreams are made of. I did nothing but sink, dread blanketing me. I couldn't see what was in front of me. I shouldn't have to gravel with gratitude. Am I grateful? Fuck yeah. But everyone should have access to gender-affirming and life-saving healthcare. It just should be. You know, the thing I really loved about this book is how honest, raw, and personal it was. It was honestly really hard to read at times, including Page describing being sexually harassed and sexually assaulted multiple times as a young Hollywood star, being bullied by his stepmother while his father did nothing whatsoever to defend him, and his struggles with gender dysphoria and the associated eating disorders, mental health challenges, and self-harm. But the other thing I loved is I felt Page demonstrated you can struggle with all those things and come out on the other side happy and fulfilled, which is how Page felt after transitioning. I also felt like Page put himself out there as a possibility model for younger LGBTQIA people reading this book.
I have been meaning to read this book, and I feel crazy that I haven't yet because he introduced me at the Gender Liberation March, and I have been in so many spaces with Page that, like, I just should do better. So, Elliot, apologies for me being such a nudge and not reading the book, but I'm absolutely going to have to get to it, especially after, Anthony's very compelling synopsis of the book.
Stephen, it's a great read. I highly, highly, highly recommend it.
Oh, Daniel read Page Boy for his school book report, and I read it alongside him. And Daniel loved that Elliot Page was just so vulnerable, but there's also this part about music, the nostalgia of what was happening in his day-to-day with these songs that Daniel loves. And so when Daniel finally got to meet Elliot Page, they had a long talk about the music in the book. And I think it just meant a lot to know that there's somebody who cares about music and is reflected in the same ways. It was really lovely.
That is nice. That is nice. So I want to talk about my first book. My first book is No Ashes in the Fire by Darnell L. Moore. Now, this memoir memoir recounts Darnell's experience growing up Black and queer in Camden, New Jersey. And he writes about the intersections of race, sexuality, and gender with what I consider some real rawness and honesty. And what resonated most with me was how Darnell found strength in vulnerability. His journey from surviving a hate crime to becoming a leading voice for social justice was really deeply inspiring. And because he was talking about Camden, a community that I am currently working in, and talking about things like Urban Promise and organizations with which I work, it was really connecting for me in a way that I didn't anticipate. Like, I didn't know that this author was from Camden, New Jersey. I didn't know this author would be speaking about places and people and instances and organizations that I'm working with. And I didn't know he would speak with such depth and honesty. It really got me.
It's amazing how memoirs like this can open up conversations about intersectionality. Did he talk about how his upbringing influenced his activism?
He did. He did. And it was interesting because a large part of what he was dealing with was the violence that he observed in his own household growing up, watching his father abuse his mother and not recognizing the ways in which what he observed as a child impacted him. But once he was able to recognize the ways in which that violence was turned inward and how he didn't really fully embrace his queerness and tried to push that down with violence, and just how repeating those cycles of violence in his own life impacted his relationships with other people and impacted his ability to see the fact that he was a survivor through this violence, and living his authentic self helped him in his activism, helped him relate to other queer people who were similarly affected. Because we're talking about somebody who grew up in the 80s for whom queerness was really frowned upon. As a Black queer man, you were the butt of jokes. You were a thing to be reviled. And once he found a place to love himself and stopped engaging in those cycles of violence against himself and against members of community, it really changed the dynamic for his activism. I've heard about this book, but I want to read it and add it to my list.
Stephen, that does sound like an excellent book. Obviously, having grown up in New Jersey and being familiar with Camden as well, that will definitely resonate with me. And I know it's one of the ones that's on the list that you gave me that I haven't quite got to yet, but it's definitely the next one in the queue after the one that I'm reading right now. So definitely looking forward to reading that.
This first book is my favorite book that I've read this year, Hijab Butch Blues by Lamya H, which is a throwback to Judith Butler's very famous book by a similar name. Lamya is a non-binary queer Muslim who reflects on their life and faith through a series of personal essays that they weave together, sharing their experiences with biblical Islamic stories, creating a deeply layered narrative. I think what made this book really special for me is that Lamya shared really personal stories around colorism and finding and questioning your faith and then finding yourself in the words. It was really, really special. And I think the title in itself, I think, is really, really important, because if you speak to transmasculine people, they'll say that Judith Butler's work is where they found themselves. And I think Lamya creating this book with these essays and making it that title is a nod to the fact that Muslim, queer, non-binary, trans people can find themselves and their faith in their writing. And so I think it makes it really, really special.
Yeah, so I just read this book and I really enjoyed it, and I echo a lot of your thoughts. It made me sad, though. It made me sad from the perspective of, first off, they couldn't use their real name. They couldn't put their real name on the book, and certainly in the book, and maybe this has changed since, I doubt it, but they are not out to their family back in the country that their family lives in. And the way that they describe the reason that they're not out, it made all the sense in the world to me, but it made me really, really sad. And I think it really kind of, pointed out to me just how difficult it is that, when people are in these positions where they don't feel like they can just be completely out, to the ones that they're closest to their loved ones. Look, it really seems like they have found this wonderful sense of community. And certainly at the end of the book, it sounds like they found someone that they really cared about. And so I was very, very happy for them. And I'm really hopeful that they're continuing to, just live this proud life. But it did, like I said, just make me sad. And it speaks to the fact that it's just so tough, being genderqueer in this environment.
Well, and it's important that you say that, because there's no reference to the country they're from other than Zeus saying it's illegal for them to exist in their queerness in this country, right? Just literally illegal. And so I think it also puts into perspective how safety, when there's political harm that can happen to you, shifts your ability to exist with even within your family network, right? So it was a lot to unpack, and it's just so beautifully written.
One thing that I really appreciated about the book was the reframing of stories from the Quran. Having read the Quran and having been very familiar with those stories, the way they recast them and the way they added context and the way they used the examples of those stories in their lives. Like, I love the way their mother kept telling them about Miriam and the sacrifices that they made, or no, not Miriam. I can't remember the particular character's name, but the way this character just suffered the violence of the Pharaoh and just suffered it and suffered it and suffered it, knowing that eventually they were going to be rewarded in heaven. And how Lamya was like, yeah, no, like, no. Every time their cousin or their friend talked about what they were going through in their marriages, how they were not going to allow that story to define the way the relationships were supposed to go. So I love the resistance and the reframing of stories and the ownership that they took of stories from the Quran. So I was really moved by this book, and I think it's a must read for anyone who's trying to understand what genderqueer people, what gender expansive people grapple with when trying to reconcile faith and family with identity.
Stephen, can I touch on something? Because you bring up something so important, is that the stories that were shared are the Old Testament stories that we of other Christian faiths learn as well. And I think reading this book reminds you how much more connected we are in so many ways. But the Islamophobia that has been driven by the United States makes people believe a different narrative. And I think that there's so much bridge building that happens in Hijab Butch Blues.
Absolutely.
So my second recommendation is The Bold World, a memoir of family and transformation by author, activist, beauty explorer, brand ambassador, and mother of five, Jodie Patterson, that was published in 2019. Patterson was also the first Black person elected chair of the board of the Human Rights Campaign. Here is the Goodreads synopsis of The Bold World. Inspired by her transgender son, activist Jodie Patterson explores identity, gender, race, and authenticity to tell the real-life story of a family's history and transformation. So, Stephen, this is one of the several books you recommended to me, and I have to admit, about a third of the way through it, I wasn't sure why. Basically, the book starts off with Patterson describing her upbringing in a swanky part of Manhattan with her highly successful, trailblazing father, her mother, who was the rock of the family, and her rebellious sister, Ramona. It wasn't until Patterson has her third child, Penelope, who was identified as a girl at birth, but announces to her mother at 3 years old that he is a boy, before the LGBTQIA experience enters the story. Once I finished reading The Bold World, it made perfect sense to me. To understand how Patterson unconditionally affirmed and supported Penelope and became an LGBTQIA activist, you have to understand her early upbringing and her formative experiences. So the other thing that I'll say that I really love about this book is how Patterson weaves intersectionality into her understanding and advocacy for her son. This is a Black woman raising mixed race children, one who is transgender, and she just has this intuitive understanding of how the struggles of ethnic minorities, women, and members of the LGBTQIA community are all related. The other thing is Patterson gives exactly zero fucks. If you are not trying to be supportive, she is not trying to include you in her world. I just love the sheer ferocity of her advocacy, and I'm just going to say right now, I want to be friends with her. It's never going to happen, but I want to be friends with her.
Oh, it's gonna happen. That's our peeps. That's our peeps. Jodie is peeps. Okay, know this now.
She hasn't been on the show yet because
She's booked for February 11th.
Oh, damn. Okay, my bad. Continue.
I will step aside for you if you want to speak to Jodie.
Lizette, that is the nicest thing that anyone has ever done for me, and I will probably take you up on that offer.
You're so silly.
She's incredible. She inspires me so much, and I bug her all the time.
So, if we could talk about the book for a second, I too read The Bold World on my flight to Nigeria. I read it in one sitting, and I was blown away. I was blown away by this book. Number one, I appreciate it because this was a Black woman raising Black children in America, and And I have been looking for stories like mine. And in the Bold World, I found a very similar story. Second, knowing Jodie, I have a newfound appreciation for the ferocity that she has because now I understand what it comes out of. Before I was just like, this is a fierce Black woman. Now I understand this is a fierce Black woman who has known struggle and continues to struggle to support all children, not just her own. And then, like, the one thing that I took away from the story was like the struggle she had with her husband, Joe, because he wasn't immediately on board. He loved their children, but he wasn't immediately on board. And they went to a camping trip, and it was like a camping trip for transgender and gender expansive children. And he finally found a tribe of other men who were all like, it just takes us longer to get there. Like, we get there, but it just takes us longer to get there. And I was just like, it shouldn't, but I get it. But it was one of those things I was conflicted because I was just like, yeah, Joe, like you gotta ride or die with your children. You gotta ride or die with your wife, especially when it comes to supporting your children. So that was the one thing I kind of grapple with. And I really want to like talk to Jodie about like how she was able to work through that because I'm doing this all by myself. And I can't imagine what it would be like if my partner wasn't lockstep with me, if I felt like I had to pull them along. And I know from all the conversations I've had with so many different parents that that's a real thing. And it's a conflict that creates problems in the family, problems in the relationships, problems for the children. And so I just found it really honest that she shared that in her book with us.
I agree. I remember admitting to Jose, thank God you're on board because I would have had to divorce you. Like I was very adamant in my mind, like you're out.
No, I get it. So my next book is Maeve Rising by Maeve Duvally. Now, this is another memoir by Maeve Duvally, who is a high-powered Wall Street executive who transitioned later in life. And the story she tells is about how she navigated the challenges of transitioning in a male-dominated industry, hello, Wall Street, while staying true to herself. And what really struck me about Maeve's story is that she demonstrated what I consider immense bravery in the face of pressure. Her story to me is a reminder that it's never too late to live authentically. And I definitely encourage people to read it because it helps you connect with the challenges of people who are late to their transition and the unique challenges that they face transitioning late. Like the story of Will and Harper is a movie that kind of illustrates that challenge, and Maeve's book is very much of that caliber.
So, Stephen, I haven't read this book. This is also on my list. I can't wait to read this book. As you know, Stephen, I have worked on Wall Street virtually my entire career, and I've had some level of success. I'm a fairly senior person. I've been a fairly senior person for quite some time. And I had to, sort of rise through the ranks as an African American, right? And there aren't a lot of African Americans in this business, but you know what? There's a lot fewer of in this business, out transgender individuals, whether we're talking about men, whether we're talking about women. I don't think I've met a single one. So I am very, very interested to read how Maeve was able to navigate this all to get to the place that she is. And I'm sure that it's going to be incredibly inspiring for me. So I cannot wait to read this book.
It's on my to-do list. Okay, so my second book is The History of the Transgender Child by Jules Gill-Peterson. This groundbreaking work reveals that transgender children have existed throughout history, even in times and places where we didn't even have the language to describe who they were. The book challenges the idea that trans identities are a new phenomenon or trend. What I loved a lot about this book and the work that Jules Gill-Peterson does in her Substack, Sad Brown Girl, which I recommend everybody follow, is that while the book has a lot of data, has a lot of historical information, it's written like a textbook, there are glimpses of what parents need to do in order to shift this political moment. I don't have a direct quote in front of me, but I want to share that there's a quote at the end of the book that says, "The world that she wants to live in and build is one where parents would be joyous to have a transgender child, and for transgender children to be children and to grow up." And I think that that's really powerful. It's a testament. I feel like while Daniel socially transitioned at 8, he's had the opportunity to grow up trans and to be loved. And I too want to be a part of that work and to be a part of that change. And I think that our podcast is a testament to that, to challenging parents to see parenting trans youth, LGBTQI youth as a place of joy and responsibility, as opposed to like sadness and loss. And so this book means a lot to me. Her work means a lot to me. Again, I highly recommend reading Sad Brown Girl Substack. This should be number 2 on your book list, Anthony, when you're done reading the other one.
So we have to just add a disclaimer to the history of the transgender child because, as you said, it reads like a textbook. It reads like a piece of academia and not like a narrative or a memoir or a piece of fiction. And so it is heavy. It's plotting. It is not an easy read by any stretch of the imagination. I read it, and I read it in the early days of Hobbes's sharing his identity with me, where it was important for me to be grounded in the facts of gender expansive identities, to be grounded in the facts of this is not new. So much of what we're hearing today, especially coming from the right, is that this is a trend, it's a virus, it's experimental. Like there's all of these things that are being said, which are belied by the histories, the documented histories of gender expansive people throughout time. And I'm saying throughout time because even before Western society started memorializing things in their textbooks and treatises, Native indigenous communities were recording these in pictures, in stories, in oral traditions, in their societies themselves, the way their societies were structured around these gender expansive people who were at the epicenter of these communities. And what Jules Gill-Peterson does is talk about that rich cultural, historical record that exists around transgender people that, for the most part, is hidden from most histories and most conversations around transgender people. So I really recommend the book as like a reference material book, not so much a storytelling book, but I think it's an important thing to have in your library. Absolutely.
So my final recommendation is the 2015 book, Becoming Nicole, The Transformation of American Family by Pulitzer Prize winning author Amy Ellis Nutt. Goodreads describes Becoming Nicole as the inspiring story of a transgender girl, her identical twin brother, and an ordinary American family's extraordinary journey to understand, nurture, and celebrate the uniqueness in us all. This is obviously a book that is very personal to both of you, as Wayne Maines starred alongside Stephen and Chewie in Lucina Fisher's Emmy Award-winning documentary, The Dads, and has been a guest on this podcast, as has his daughter, actress and activist Nicole Maines. I loved this book. I really, really did, for a number of reasons. First off, the book follows a complete history of the Maines family, including when Wayne and his wife Kelly adopted Nicole and her identical twin brother Jonas from one of Kelly's underage relatives. I think this is really important because Nicole and Jonas were raised in the same household by the same parents, and while Jonas is cisgender, Nicole knew from an early age she was transgender. And to me, that fundamentally disproves the ridiculous notion that somehow when people are transgender, it is because of something in their environment, which in many cases is blamed on their parents, usually the mother. The other thing I love about this book is there are 2 transitions that happen, Nicole's, but also Wayne's, right? I don't have to tell either of you that Wayne is a very traditional, politically conservative man's man. And early in the book, he really struggles with the fact that Nicole is transgender and quite frankly tries to discourage her from expressing her identity. But over time, as Nicole begins to socially transition, has difficulties at her school that ultimately result in the family moving and eventually winning a landmark case in front of the Maine Supreme Court, allowing individuals to use the bathrooms aligning with their gender identities. Wayne not only comes around, but becomes an ardent supporter of his daughter and an activist for transgender rights. I think the transition that Wayne goes through offers a wonderful example of how even if parents do not initially understand, that does not mean they cannot become supportive advocates after spending the time and the effort to educate themselves.
This book is the book that I share with dads all the time because of exactly what you said, Anthony. It's like a portal into the world of parenting children that is raw, it's honest, and it shows the challenges that a lot of people go through grappling with gender expansive kids. It's not like we're out here saying, hey, yay, my kid is trans, or my kid is gender, expansive, my kid is non-binary. Most parents go through what Wayne went through, trying to figure out where he went wrong or where his wife went wrong, or trying to assign blame or responsibility, and ultimately come to the realization that it's my kid. I love this kid, and I'm going to go to the ends of the world to protect my kid. And it's important because I need dads to get there quicker. I need parents to get there quicker. I need parents to understand the first and foremost thing that you have to do is support your child, period, point blank. And Wayne sharing his story and sharing his struggle is a really good way to get other parents on board quicker. Like, you don't have to go through the struggle. Other parents have, but here's an example of what not to do and how to support your children ultimately the right way. So I just love this book and I continue to recommend it. And I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
Anthony, I feel like you are on this parent journey with us. And it makes you like such a special ally because you're parenting in proximity, which is a testament to your love of Hobbes. You engaging in these book reviews and taking the time to read. I'm going to get really emotional. I'm sorry, I haven't slept a lot, but it's what we want all of our family members to do. And so I don't have anything. I love Wayne. Wayne, I love you. You know this, but thank you, Anthony.
Lizette, you always do this to me. You always fuck me up. Like, here I am. I'm just going through, my little, reviews, whatever. And then you fuck me up. You get me all my feelings. I'm getting teary here. You always do this to me. I should have expected it. But no, seriously, thank you. And it's funny because, like, honestly, I think when I had this sort of like epiphany, it was when, Stephen and I, when Stephen was in Evanston at my next door neighbors, and we were doing this fundraiser for the dads too, and Lucina was there, and it was this wonderful event. And at one point I emceed this conversation between Stephen, Lucina, and Alex, who's in the dads too. And and afterwards, like, people were coming up to me and they were asking me questions and so forth and so on. And I just realized, like, I almost felt like a fraud because I'm like, okay, don't get me wrong, I'm very, very supportive, but I don't know that much about what I'm talking about. Right? Like, in other words, like, I've learned a ton. Don't get me wrong, I've learned a ton, honestly, from listening to every episode of your podcast. But the way I learn is I learn through reading. And so I just felt like, okay, you know what? If I'm going to truly be an advocate and the self-appointed executive producer of this podcast, I really have to start to educate myself. And it's but I do appreciate that. And you fucked my shit up again and got me off with my feelings. So thanks for that.
And Stephen, as the oldest in my family, and we give our younger siblings a hard time, him doing this for you is like how our siblings love us. Like, our little siblings love us. And this is like love in action. So anyway, I'm glad to be a part of this.
Anywho, don't get this fool a big head. My last pick is American Teenager by Nico Lang. I had the privilege of reading this book before it was published, and Nico sent me a pre-publication version of this collection of essays, which captures the complexities of growing up queer in America. Nico went around the country talking to different families and gender expansive children, and he writes their stories with honesty and humor about everything from first crushes to systemic discrimination, painting a really vivid picture of queer youth experiences in this country. And what I found most compelling about Nico's ability to blend vulnerability with wit is, once again, the raw and relatable tales that he told that are equal parts heartwarming and heartbreaking. He opens the book talking about a family getting ready to move because it's not safe for their children. And like, literally, Anthony's talking about being in his feels. Like, that book opens up with me being in my feels. I know the family that he's talking about. I know the mother that he's talking about. I know the child that he's talking about. And I know, because we are once again in a space and time in this country where people are considering moving out of the country to protect their children. The inability to get passports with the right gender marker or the right name because the country has now become so targeted in its attack on transgender people. Nico's book is a salve because they talk about how to protect your joy in the midst of all the fuckery that genderqueer, gender expansive children go through.
So, I just got very emotional just now based on what Lizette said. I'm emotional again, but I'm emotional a very different way. Anger, immense anger, because I read this book as well, and I really, really enjoyed it. But one of my biggest takeaways is these are kids. These are fucking kids. Okay. And all of these people, and I'm not going to both sides of shit because that'd be bullshit. All these Republican fuckers that are going out of their way to make these people's lives, these kids' lives miserable, you can fuck all the way off. You can fuck all the way off. Because honestly, and I think like this is one of these things, like I knew it intuitively, right? Like I'd read the statistics about, about trans kids and, higher suicide rates and self-harm and all of these things, right? I'd read the statistics, but reading this book, looking at these individual kids, like the one kid who didn't have access to gender affirming care and started to detransition. I mean, it's like you're torturing these kids, and kids are going to die because of these things that you're doing. And all these kids want to do is be regular teenagers, just like every other teenager. So fuck you, fuck all of you, fuck you all to hell. That's it, I'm done.
So I was literally texting with Nico this morning because Daniel at this moment is sitting on a Creating Change stage talking about this book with Nico. And Nico asked me to send a blurb. And the thing that I found the most important about this book, and it's what I told Nico in my blurb, is that there's a reason why they've chosen sports and gender affirming care, because it's a reductive debate around body parts. And what Nico's story, what Nico's book does is it shows a whole human being loved by their families, loved by their friends, the angst of the teenagedom, right? Like you see a whole person in each of these stories. And I told Nico, this is how you culture shift, because it's no longer reductive. You see kids who just need access to and the love of the people around them. And so, Anthony, you hit the nail on the head. Fuck all these people. And, we're going to do everything we need to do to keep them safe.
That part.
So my final book is called The Native Country of the Heart by Cherrie Moraga. And I found this book because Cherrie Moraga is a very famous author and activist, Chicana activist, and her words are often quoted in different activist spaces. And as a fellow Chicana, I wanted to hear her story told to me, and I wanted to learn. And oftentimes in our cultural communities, we're told that queer people did not exist, that this isn't our thing. This is a white people thing. And to read this story and to hear how she found herself and paved a way forward in a time when people say that queer people didn't exist was really powerful for me. So I highly recommend this book to everyone.
So, what's so funny, Lizette, when Anthony came up with the idea for this episode, and I was just like, okay, Lizette, what books do you want to talk about on the podcast? And you sent me this book. I was like, I don't know this title. I don't know this author, but I'm intrigued. And so it has been ordered, and I will read it because I think, once again, there are cultural nuances that inform how people live, and it is a part of our society. We are not a monolith. We are a diverse group of people from so many different walks of life, from so many different places, from so many different spaces, and our experiences are unique. And so for me to have an appreciation for another culture, for a Chicana person's experience, I need to read the words and the lived experience of a Chicana person. And that will help me when I'm out in the world advocating for other people to have that experience as part of my understanding of how people exist in this world. And so I think it's important. And I love the fact that we've talked about Black queer people, Muslims, Chicanas, white people, rich people, people that are non-binary and gay and queer and all of these different things. And we're saying, hey, listeners, consume all of this richness because it will help you be a better advocate. It will help you be a better ally. It will help you be a better parent to your gender expansive child. It'll help you be a better person just through and through. So I just love that we did this today. And I really do appreciate Anthony's recommendation that we do this.
That's what self-appointed executive producers are for.
And I just adore you both so much.
So like I said, I'm adding this one to my list because it sounds like such a rich and layered memoir that I've got to read it. Well, this wraps our episode of these 9 incredible books. Thank you, Lizette and Anthony, for sharing your insights. It's always a joy to hear your perspectives and share space with you.
And thank you, Stephen and Anthony, for letting me share in this moment of dialogue around these really incredible books. And to our listeners, we hope that these titles inspire you as much as they inspired us.
Well, I just feel like I have to get the last word. First off, Stephen, thank you for all the wonderful book recommendations. And Lizette, thank you for recommending a couple books on this episode that I haven't read yet. We'll definitely add them to the list.
So folks, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram and TikTok, and do whatever you've got to do to stay up to date with everything going on here at the Parent Advocates Podcast. Goodbye. Bye.
We out.